Mark a split-second decision that changed everything. Officer Mark Reynolds had been patrolling the streets of Austin, Texas for nearly 20 years. He had seen it all: reckless drivers, late-night brawls, and the occasional high-speed chase. But that night, just past 10 p.m., the streets were quiet, the kind of shift he preferred. Parked near a dimly lit gas station, he sipped his coffee, his eyes scanning the road for any sign of trouble. That was when he noticed it. A sleek black Mercedes rolling through an intersection. It was one of those high-end models, the kind that usually belonged to wealthy executives or celebrities. Nothing about it seemed suspicious, except for one small detail. The driver hadn't used a turn signal. Technically, it was a violation, a minor one. But rules were rules. Maybe tonight, Mark thought, he'd remind someone of that. He flicked on his lights. The car's brake lights flared, and the driver smoothly pulled over to the curb. Mark took his time stepping out, adjusting his belt and radio. The air was still, the hum of distant traffic the only sound as he approached the driver's side. The window rolled down slowly, revealing a man in his mid-50s, neatly dressed in a dark gray suit, his salt and pepper beard neatly trimmed. He looked expensive, like someone who belonged in that car. His hands rested calmly on the steering wheel, fingers barely moving. He wasn't nervous, he wasn't fidgeting, he was just waiting. Mark felt something tighten in his chest. He didn't like that look. Not apologetic, not intimidated, just patient. "License and registration," he said, his voice firmer than necessary. The man blinked once, then reached toward his glove compartment in a slow, controlled movement, as if he already knew what Mark was thinking. "May I ask why I'm being stopped, officer?" His voice was calm, measured. Mark crossed his arms. Failure to signal a turn back there. A beat passed, a slow breath. "Did I?" The man's tone wasn't hostile, but there was something in it, a quiet challenge. Mark's grip on his belt tightened. He didn't like challenges. "License and registration," he repeated. The man handed over the documents without hesitation. No shaking hands, no nervous explanation, just compliance without submission. Mark barely glanced at the ID before flipping it over. His irritation grew. "You live around here?" he asked. The man let out a quiet exhale. Not a sigh, not disrespectful, just deliberate. "I don't see how that's relevant." Something in Mark snapped. "Step out of the vehicle." For the first time, the man's expression changed. His jaw tensed slightly, his head tilting. "Why?" "I asked you to step out," Mark said, voice clipped. A muscle in the man's cheek twitched, but he didn't argue. He sighed, unbuckled his seatbelt, and stepped out. He was taller than Mark expected, broad-shouldered. He didn't move aggressively, but there was something in his presence that made Mark's pulse tick up. "Hands on the trunk," Mark ordered. The man turned, placed his palms flat against the cool metal, and let out another steady breath. Mark's heart pounded. He could feel it now, the power shift. This was his moment to remind the man who was in charge. He pressed a hand against the man's back, guiding him down just slightly. The man stiffened. And before Mark even realized what he was doing, before he could process the decision, his palm slapped across the man's cheek, a sharp, stinging crack that echoed in the quiet street. The man's head jerked to the side. His body froze completely. Mark's own breath hitched. The world felt still. Then slowly, the man turned his head back to face him. His expression unreadable, his jaw clenched just once before he took a steady breath. And then, in the most controlled, deliberate movement, he reached into his jacket pocket. Mark's stomach twisted. The man pulled out his ID, held it up. Henry Lawson. Mark's eyes flickered down, scanning the title beneath the name. Chief of Police, his superior. Mark's pulse roared in his ears. His fingers went numb. The ground beneath him felt like it had just cracked wide open. And standing right in front of him, Chief Henry Lawson just watched. But this was far from over. Mark Reynolds froze. The ID in Henry Lawson's hand might as well have been a loaded weapon. Chief of Police, not just a cop, not just some off-duty officer, his boss. Mark's heartbeat pounded against his ribs. His fingers twitched, his mind racing for an escape, an excuse, anything to take back what had just happened. Lawson didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't snatch his ID back or demand an explanation. He just watched. And somehow, that was worse. A voice cut through the tension. "Everything okay here, Officer Reynolds?" Mark turned sharply. Another patrol car had pulled up. The red and blue lights cast fractured shadows across the pavement. Officer Dan Murphy, Mark's usual partner, stood just a few feet away, his face twisted in confusion. Opened his mouth, searching for words, but before he could speak, Lawson answered for him. "Fine," the chief said smoothly, tucking his ID back into his pocket. "Your officer here was just conducting a routine stop." Murphy glanced between them, his frown deepening. "Sir, But Lawson wasn't looking at him. His eyes stayed on Mark. "Am I free to go?" Lawson's voice was calm, deliberate. Mark felt his chest tighten. He was trapped, and he knew it. This was the moment. He could say yes, let Lawson leave, hope he wouldn't report it. Or he could try to reclaim control, push back, make it worse. His throat burned. A low chuckle rumbled from Lawson's throat. Not amusement, not anger, just something cold. "Officer Reynolds." Lawson tilted his head slightly. "Are you detaining me?" Mark felt Murphy's eyes on him now, his confusion shifting into something closer to concern. He didn't know. He hadn't seen what happened. Mark's jaw tightened. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. "No, sir." Lawson exhaled, a slow, measured breath, before glancing at Murphy. "Good to see some officers in this department still conduct themselves professionally," he said smoothly. Then, without another word, he turned, walked back to his car, slid into the driver's seat, and pulled away. Mark stood frozen, watching the taillights disappear into the night. But the moment Lawson's car was gone, Murphy turned to him. "Mark," he said, his voice low, urgent. "What the hell was that?" Mark clenched his jaw. Just a stop, he wanted to say, but the words wouldn't come. Murphy studied him for a beat longer, then exhaled. "Fine, I'll write up the stop." He shook his head. "You good?" Mark swallowed hard. "Yeah." Murphy hesitated, then nodded, heading back to his cruiser. Mark turned toward his own, reaching for the door handle, but his stomach twisted. Lawson had let him walk away. No scene, no immediate consequences. But he wasn't done with him yet, and Mark knew it. Mark barely slept that night. He lay stiff in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over. The way Lawson had looked at him, the way he had let him go. No shouting, no threats, no immediate punishment. Just that silence, heavy, deliberate. It would have been easier if Lawson had yelled, if he had pulled rank, humiliated him on the spot. At least then, Mark would have known where he stood. Instead, he was waiting. And that was worse. By morning, Mark's stomach was in knots. His hands shook as he buttoned his uniform. Maybe it would blow over. Maybe Lawson had decided not to report it. His phone buzzed on the dresser. A single message. Internal Affairs. Report to the chief's office immediately. Mark's breath caught in his throat. It was happening. He drove to the station in silence, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. As soon as he walked in, he felt the eyes on him. Officers milled around the break room. The front desk clerk barely looked up, but Mark knew how this worked. Word always got around. He stepped into the elevator. The seconds stretched like hours. The hallway to Lawson's office felt longer than it should have. He forced himself to breathe as he reached for the handle and stepped inside. Lawson was at his desk, flipping through a file. He didn't look up. But someone else was there. Captain Joel Harris, a 20-year veteran of the force. Arms crossed, face unreadable. The air in the room shifted. Finally, Lawson looked up. "Officer Reynolds." His voice was even, controlled. "Sit." Mark's legs felt stiff as he lowered himself into the chair. Lawson leaned back, clasping his hands together. His face gave nothing away. Mark Klenn, then, after a long pause, he finally spoke. "Tell me," he said, voice smooth but firm. "How would you report last night's stop?" Mark Reynolds sat stiffly in the chair, his hands pressed against his knees. The air in Chief Henry Lawson's office felt too heavy, the walls too close. Across from him, Lawson sat calmly, hands folded, watching him like a man who already knew the answers, but wanted to hear them anyway. Beside Lawson stood Captain Joel Harris, his arms crossed, expression unreadable. Mark swallowed hard. "How would you report last night's stop?" Lawson's voice was even, almost too controlled. Mark forced himself to breathe, but the air felt thick in his lungs. Routine stop for failure to signal. That was the technical answer, but they weren't here for technicalities. Mark's jaw clenched. "Routine stop," he said finally, voice tight. Lawson gave a slow nod, like he had expected that answer. "And what happened next?" Mark's throat felt dry. "I asked the driver for identification," he said carefully, choosing each word like he was walking through a minefield. Lawson's brow lifted just slightly. "And then?" Mark gritted his teeth. "He questioned why he was being stopped." A long pause. Lawson turned to Captain Harris. "Would you say questioning an officer is considered uncooperative?" Harris barely, "Not unless the driver refuses to comply." Lawson's eyes slid back to Mark. "Did I refuse to comply, Officer Reynolds?" Mark's pulse pounded in his ears. "No, sir." Lawson exhaled, a slow, measured breath. He nodded, then asked the question Mark had been dreading. "And then?" Ched his fists. This was it. He could try to explain it away, frame it as a misunderstanding, twist the words so that it didn't sound as bad as it was. But there was no way around it. Mark licked his lips, his voice barely above a whisper. "I struck the suspect." Lawson's expression didn't change. "Suspect?" he repeated, the words sharp, deliberate. Mark's stomach twisted. Lawson leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Why did you hit me, Officer Reynolds?" The question sank into Mark like a hook. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He had asked himself that same thing 100 times since last night. But here, now, sitting in front of his boss, the man he had humiliated on the street. The truth felt heavier than ever. Lawson's voice was steady, but there was something cold beneath it. "Did you feel threatened?" Mark's heart thudded against his ribs. "No, sir." "Did I resist?" "No, sir." "Did I insult you?" Mark's fingernails dug into his palms. "No, sir." Lawson watched him for a long, agonizing moment. "Then what exactly made you strike me?" The room felt too small. The walls pressed in. Mark's throat locked up. He had no answer. Lawson exhaled through his nose, nodding like that silence had been the answer he expected all along. Then, without a word, he reached into his desk, pulled out a single sheet of paper, and slid it across the desk. Mark's heart stopped. A suspension notice. "You're off duty until further notice," Lawson said simply. Mark's hands shook as he reached for the paper. "Chief, But Lawson was already standing. "Dismissed." Mark felt like he was sinking. He rose to his feet, his legs numb beneath him. Captain Harris opened the door, but as Mark stepped out, Lawson's voice cut through the silence one last time. "We're not done." Mark stiffened. He didn't turn around. Didn't dare to. He just gripped the suspension notice so tightly the paper crumpled in his fist and walked out. A second chance or the end of the line. Mark sat on his couch, staring at the paper in his hands. 60 days. Unpaid. Mandatory de-escalation training. A second offense? Termination. His chest felt tight. It could have been worse. Hell, it should have been worse. But all he could feel was shame. Not just for what he had done, but for how easily he had convinced himself he was right when he wasn't. The next morning, his phone buzzed. A single message. Henry Lawson. Riverside Park. 10 minutes. Mark stared at the screen, his pulse a mess. A meeting. Not official. Not in the office. His fingers hovered over the screen. For a second he thought about ignoring it, but he knew he couldn't. He grabbed his jacket and headed out. When he arrived, the park was nearly empty. A few joggers, a couple walking their dog, streetlights casting long shadows against the pavement. And then, there he was. Lawson stood near the edge of the river, hands in his pockets, staring at the water. He didn't look up as Mark approached. For a moment, Mark hesitated, considered walking away. But something about the way Lawson stood there, calm, unreadable, kept his feet moving. He stopped a few feet away. "You called me," he said. Lawson nodded, still not looking at him. "Do you know why I didn't report you to internal affairs myself?" Mark swallowed hard. He had wondered that, wondered why it had been handled so quietly. Lawson finally turned to face him. "Because I wanted you to sit with it first," he said. "To feel it." Mark's jaw tensed. "I do." Lawson shook his head. "No, you don't." His voice was level, but the weight behind it was undeniable. "Not yet." Mark Reynolds stood still, the wind rustling through the trees at Riverside Park. The night air was cool, crisp, but it did nothing to ease the tightness in his chest. Chief Henry Lawson watched him with the same calm, unreadable expression he had worn the night before. Mark wanted to look away, but he didn't. "Sit," Lawson said, nodding toward a bench. Mark hesitated, then did as he was told. Lawson followed, resting his elbows on his knees as he stared out at the dark water. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Lawson exhaled, a slow, measured breath. "You ever been pulled over, Reynolds?" The question caught Mark off guard. "What?" Lawson didn't look at him. "A routine stop," he clarified. "Ever had a cop flash their lights at you? Ask for your license? Ask you where you were going?" Mark frowned. "I mean, maybe once or twice." Lawson nodded slightly. "I've lost count." Mark's stomach tightened. Lawson leaned back against the bench, his gaze still on the river. "Every city I've lived in," he continued. "I've had cops stop me. Ask me why I was there. Even in my own damn neighborhood." Mark swallowed. Hard. He didn't know what to say. Lawson finally turned toward him. "You hit me because you were frustrated," he said. "But ask yourself, why was I frustrating you?" Mark felt his jaw tighten. He knew the answer. He just didn't want to say it. Lawson didn't let him off the hook. "Because I didn't act afraid of you," he said. Mark's breath hitched. "You expected me to be nervous," Lawson continued. "To scramble for my wallet, to act like I was guilty of something." He watched Mark closely. "And when I didn't, when I stayed calm, that made you mad." Mark clenched his fists. "That's not—" He stopped himself. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't a truth he was ready to face. Lawson shook his head. "You don't see it, do you?" His voice wasn't angry. It wasn't mocking. It was tired. "You don't see how deep it runs." Mark inhaled sharply. "I'm not racist?" Lawson finished for him. Mark's throat closed up. Lawson nodded, like he'd heard the excuse 1,000 times before. "Maybe not," he said. "But what do you call it when you assume someone's a threat just for existing?" The words hit hard. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the river, the distant hum of the city, filled the silence. Finally, Lawson sighed. "I didn't ask you here to tear you apart," he said. "I asked you here because you've got a choice to make." Mark frowned. "What choice?" Lawson turned toward him, his expression unreadable. "You can walk away from this and tell yourself it was just a mistake." His voice was quiet, but there was no mistaking the weight behind it. "Or you can sit with it, really sit with it, and ask yourself why it happened." Mark looked away, staring at the water. Lawson stood. When Internal Affairs calls you back in, they're going to ask if you've learned anything. He took a step back. Figure out what your answer is going to be. And just like that, he walked away. Mark sat there watching his boss disappear into the night, and for the first time since the stop, he let himself feel the full weight of what he had done. The consequences. Mark spent the next 3 days drowning in silence. His phone barely rang. No calls from the precinct. No texts from his usual work friends. No updates. It was as if he had been wiped clean from the department overnight. He should have been relieved. Should have been grateful for the time to think. But thinking was the problem. Henry Lawson's words stuck to him like oil. You can walk away from this and tell yourself it was just a mistake. Or you can sit with it. Mark had told himself for years that he wasn't the kind of cop who escalated things for no reason. That he was fair. That he treated everyone the same. But that night, with Lawson, had proved something else. Something he didn't want to admit. By the 4th day, the call finally came. Internal Affairs. Report in. Mark's hands were clammy as he gripped the wheel, driving to the station. The sun was out, but it did nothing to shake the chill in his gut. As soon as he stepped inside, he felt the eyes on him. Officers at their desks, a few glances exchanged. Hushed conversations. They knew. He kept his head down as he made his way to the conference room. The door was already open. Inside, 3 people sat waiting. Captain Joel Harris, an IA investigator named Brianna Morris, and Henry Lawson. Lawson didn't look at him as he stepped in. He just kept his hands folded on the table, staring at the file in front of him. Mark swallowed hard and sat. Morris leaned forward. "Officer Reynolds," she said, "let's talk about the stop from last week." Mark's throat was dry. "Yes, ma'am." "According to your statement," Morris continued, flipping through the papers, "you pulled the driver over for failure to signal. Is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am." She nodded. "And at what point did you escalate to physical force?" Mark's stomach twisted. He could feel Lawson's presence across the table. His silence just as loud as the question itself. Mark clenched his jaw. He exhaled, voice barely above a whisper. "I struck the driver after asking him to step out of the vehicle." Morris's eyebrow lifted slightly. "Why?" The word landed hard. Mark had rehearsed this in his head 100 times, but every excuse, every justification, suddenly felt hollow. His lips pressed together. "I lost my temper." Captain Harris shifted in his chair. Morris flipped to another page. "You wrote here that you felt the driver was being uncooperative." Mark's hands curled into fists under the table. He exhaled. "I assumed he was resisting." A long, heavy pause, and then, for the first time, Lawson looked up. Their eyes met. Mark's breath caught in his throat. Lawson's expression didn't change, but he only said one word. "Assumed?" Mark Reynolds felt his chest tighten as Chief Henry Lawson repeated that single word. "Assumed?" The silence in the conference room was thick, pressing against Mark's ribs like a weight he couldn't shake. Across the table, investigator Brianna Morris watched him carefully, pen hovering over her notepad. Mark's mouth was dry, his mind racing for something to say. Anything that might soften what had already been laid bare. But there was nothing. Because Lawson was right. He had assumed. And that assumption had nearly cost him everything. Morris finally cleared her throat. "Chief Lawson, do you have anything to add?" Lawson leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, studying Mark with the same quiet intensity that had haunted him since that night on the road. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, finally, "Not yet." Morris nodded, closing the file in front of her. "Officer Reynolds, here's where we stand," she said. "You've served on the force for 12 years. No prior disciplinary issues. That works in your favor." Mark swallowed hard, waiting for the inevitable but. Morris didn't make him wait long. "However," she continued, "this was an unjustified use of force. and that's something we can't ignore. Mark felt his stomach drop. Lawson's gaze didn't waver. Morris pushed forward. You are being placed on administrative leave without pay for 60 days. During that time, you'll be required to complete de-escalation and bias training. A second offense of this nature will result in immediate termination. Mark's hands clenched under the table. The words hit hard, but the worst part was, he deserved it. Morris let the weight of her statement settle before giving him a pointed look. Understood? Mark exhaled slowly. Yes, ma'am. She nodded. We'll finalize the paperwork. You're dismissed. Mark stood stiffly, his movements mechanical. He turned toward the door, but before he could leave, Lawson spoke again. Reynolds. Mark stopped. His grip on the door handle tightened. This isn't over, Lawson said, his voice low but firm. Mark didn't turn around. He just nodded once and walked out. The weight of silence. Mark sat in his car, staring at the suspension notice in his hands. He had read it 10 times already, but the words never changed. Indefinite administrative leave pending review. The weight of it settled in his chest, heavier than his badge had ever felt. He had never been suspended before, not once in his entire career, and now all he could do was wait. His phone buzzed on the dashboard. For a second, he thought about ignoring it, but when he glanced at the screen, his stomach dropped. Henry Lawson. Mark hesitated, fingers hovering over the screen. Then, finally, he answered. Reynolds? A pause. Then, meet me at Riverside Park, 10 minutes. The call ended before Mark could say a word. His pulse pounded as he started the engine. A conversation that couldn't be avoided. The park was nearly empty when Mark arrived. A few joggers, a couple sitting on a bench, a man walking his dog. The streetlights flickered against the pavement, casting long shadows across the path. And then, he saw him. Henry Lawson, standing near the edge of the park, hands in his pockets, watching the river move under the bridge. He didn't look up as Mark approached. For a second, Mark considered walking away. But something about the way Lawson stood there, calm, unreadable, kept his feet moving. Mark stopped a few feet away. You called me. Lawson nodded, still not looking at him. You know why I didn't report you to Internal Affairs myself? Mark swallowed. He had wondered that, wondered why it had been handled so quietly. Lawson finally turned to face him. Because I wanted you to sit with it first. Feel it. Mark's jaw tensed. I do. No, you don't. Lawson's voice was level, but the weight behind it was undeniable. Mark crossed his arms. Then what is this? Lawson studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, he nodded toward a bench. Sit. Mark hesitated, but something in Lawson's tone made it clear. This wasn't a request. He sat. Lawson followed, resting his elbows on his knees, staring out at the water. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Lawson exhaled. You ever been pulled over, Reynolds? Mark frowned. What? Lawson didn't look at him. A routine stop, he clarified. Ever had a cop flash their lights at you, ask for your license, ask you where you were going? Mark shook his head. I mean, maybe once or twice. Lawson nodded slightly. I've lost count. Mark's stomach tightened. Every city I've lived in, Lawson continued, I've had cops stop me, ask me why I was there, even in my own damn neighborhood. Mark didn't know what to say. Lawson leaned back against the bench. You hit me because you were frustrated, he said. But ask yourself, why was I frustrating you? Mark felt his jaw tighten. He knew the answer. He just didn't want to say it. Lawson didn't let him off the hook. Because I didn't act afraid of you. Mark's breath hitched. You expected me to be nervous, Lawson continued, to scramble for my wallet, to act like I was guilty of something. He watched Mark closely, and when I didn't, when I stayed calm, that made you mad. Mark clenched his fists. That's not... He stopped himself, It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't a truth he was ready to face. Lawson shook his head. "You don't see it, do you?" His voice wasn't angry. It wasn't mocking. It was tired. "You don't see how deep it runs." Mark inhaled sharply. "I'm not racist?" Lawson finished for him. Mark's throat closed up. Lawson nodded like he'd heard the excuse 1,000 times before. "Maybe not," he said. "But what do you call it when you assume someone's a threat just for existing?" The words hit hard, and for the first time since that night, Mark Reynolds had no answer. Mark Reynolds sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The conversation with Henry Lawson still echoed in his mind, each word carving itself deeper into his thoughts. "You don't see how deep it runs. What do you call it when you assume someone's a threat just for existing?" He had no answer. Not then. Not now. For years, Mark had convinced himself he was a good cop, someone who followed the rules and treated people fairly. But now he wasn't sure if he even recognized the person staring back at him in the rearview mirror. The precinct felt different when he returned. Everything looked the same. The ringing phones, the steady hum of conversation, the smell of coffee brewing in the break room. But beneath it all, he could feel it. The eyes. They knew. No one said anything. No one confronted him. But the glances, the half-whispered conversations, they were watching. He deserved it. Mark made his way to his desk, setting his things down, but before he could sit, Lawson walked by. The chief didn't stop, didn't acknowledge him, didn't even glance in his direction. But just before stepping into his office, he hesitated, turned his head. "Reynolds." Mark stiffened. "Sir." A pause. Then, "Welcome back." Mark swallowed hard. "Thank you." Lawson gave a small nod and disappeared behind his office door. It wasn't approval. It wasn't forgiveness. It was something else. A challenge. What Mark did next, that was up to him. Facing the uncomfortable truth. That afternoon, Mark sat in mandatory training, arms crossed as Joanna Pierce, a retired detective, walked to the front of the room. She was older, her short-cropped hair streaked with gray, her voice steady as she addressed the group. She didn't waste time, didn't ease them into it. She picked up the remote and clicked the projector on. A traffic stop video played. Mark's stomach twisted. It was all too familiar. The officer, white like him, pulled over a black man for a minor infraction. The tone was clipped. The suspect's voice was calm. Didn't matter. The tension rose. The officer escalated. And then, the moment came. The officer grabbed him. The screen froze on that image. Pierce turned to the room. "Let's talk about assumptions." Silence. Then, she locked eyes with Mark. "Officer Reynolds," she said evenly, "what did that cop see when he pulled that man over?" Mark felt his throat tighten. He knew the answer. "He saw a threat," he said quietly. Pierce nodded. "And what did you see when you pulled over Chief Lawson?" Mark's breath felt heavy. He knew. Didn't want to say it, but he forced himself to. "A threat." Pierce tilted her head slightly. "And was he?" Mark's stomach twisted. "No." She leaned forward slightly, her voice softer now. "Then where did that idea come from?" The words burned through him. He had no excuse, no justification, because deep down he knew the truth. It wasn't about Lawson. It was about himself. The training ended, but Mark sat motionless as the room emptied, the weight of his own realization settling in. For the first time since that night, he wasn't just hearing the truth. He was facing it. Mark Reynolds sat alone in his patrol car, parked in the dimly lit lot behind the precinct. The silence pressed against him, thick and suffocating. The day had dragged on, each hour heavier than the last. The training, the questions, the uncomfortable truths, they had all hit him harder than any disciplinary action ever could. For the past 15 years, he had worn the badge with pride. He had told himself he was one of the good ones, that he treated everyone fairly. But now? Now he wasn't sure what he believed anymore. He exhaled, gripping the steering wheel. Lawson's words echoed in his head. "You have a choice to make." Pierce's voice followed. Where did that idea come from? Mark closed his eyes, swallowing the bitterness in his throat. He had made assumptions. And worse, he had let those assumptions control his actions. For weeks, he had convinced himself he was simply following protocol, that his anger, his impulse, had been justified. But it wasn't. Lawson hadn't been a threat. He had only been a man who had been pulled over for a minor violation and treated as if he were guilty of something far worse. And now, Mark had to face the consequences. He had 60 days to think about it. 60 days of unpaid suspension, of sitting with his actions, of wondering if he could ever fully undo what had been done. Would people trust him again? Would he trust himself? Back at the precinct. 2 months later, Mark walked through the doors of the Denver Police Department, feeling like a stranger in his own station. Everything looked the same. The ringing phones, the steady shuffle of boots, the dull glow of fluorescent lights overhead. But it was different. He was different. He felt the glances, the small pauses in conversation, the way people took notice but said nothing. They knew. They didn't have to say it. Mark kept his head up, walking to his desk. He had expected resentment, maybe even hostility, but instead all he felt was distance. Before he could sit, Lawson passed by. Like before, the chief didn't stop, didn't acknowledge him, didn't say a word. But just as he reached his office door, he hesitated, turned his head slightly. "Reynolds." Mark stiffened. "Sir." A pause. Then, "Welcome back." Mark swallowed. "Thank you." Lawson nodded once, then stepped inside his office, shutting the door behind him. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't acceptance. It was something else. A challenge. Mark had a second chance. But what he did with it? That was up to him. Mark Reynolds sat at his desk, his hands resting on the cool metal surface, his thoughts heavier than the reports stacked in front of him. The weight of his return felt different than he had expected. He had thought coming back would feel like a relief, like a step toward normalcy. But normal didn't exist anymore. Every interaction, every glance from his fellow officers felt measured. Some looked at him with curiosity, others with indifference, but a few with thinly veiled judgment. And maybe they were right to judge. He had spent 15 years thinking he understood what it meant to wear the badge, to serve, to protect. But the past 2 months had shattered those illusions. Mark flipped open a file, trying to refocus. The words blurred together. He wasn't just struggling with the way people saw him. He was struggling with how he saw himself. Would he ever be the same officer again? Should he be? A test of will. The shift passed slowly. Mark went through motions, responded to calls, filled out reports. He tried to act as if nothing had changed, but it had. And soon enough, the real test came. A routine call, a dispute at a gas station. He and his partner arrived to find 2 men arguing near the pumps. One black, one white. The attendant stood by, looking anxious. Mark stepped forward. "What's going on here?" The white man, mid-50s, well-dressed, confident, turned first. "That guy's been hanging around too long, bothering customers." The black man scoffed. "I was filling my tank. Since when is that a crime?" Mark felt the tension immediately. This was it, a moment where his instincts, his choices, would define him. The choice that mattered before, Mark might have reacted differently, might have assumed, might have let his own bias cloud his actions. But not today. Today, he made a choice to listen first. He turned to the attendant. "Did you see anything happen?" The young woman behind the counter hesitated. "No, sir. He's been here for a few minutes, just pumping gas." Mark nodded, then faced the white man again. "Sir, did he do anything other than use the pump?" A pause, a flicker of hesitation. I just thought he was lingering," the man muttered. Mark exhaled, his chest tightening. How many times had that word been used as an excuse? "Sir," Mark said, keeping his voice even. "Unless you can report an actual disturbance, I suggest we let the man finish pumping his gas." The man frowned but didn't argue. Mark turned to the other driver. "Sir, you're free to go." The man studied him for a moment, like he was trying to read him. Then, with a nod, he got back in his car. As Mark walked back to his patrol car, he caught his partner watching him. "You handled that different than before," his partner said. Mark thought about it, then nodded. "Yeah, I did." Mark Reynolds sat alone in his patrol car, staring at the dim glow of the dashboard. The gas station incident lingered in his mind, not because it had escalated, but because it hadn't. He had changed. A few months ago, he might have handled that situation differently. He might have let assumptions dictate his response. But this time he had stopped himself. Listened first, thought first. And yet, the shift was over, but the work wasn't. He turned his key in the ignition and pulled out onto the quiet streets. Instead of heading home, he drove toward a familiar place, one he had been avoiding since his return. Riverside Park, a conversation that couldn't be avoided. Henry Lawson was already there, standing by the river just like before. Hands in his pockets, shoulders squared. Mark parked, stepped out, and approached. Lawson didn't turn right away. "Didn't think you'd come," he finally said. Mark sighed. Neither did I. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The distant hum of the city filled the silence. Then, Mark exhaled. "I handled a call today, a minor dispute. It could have gone the way it always used to, but it didn't." Lawson glanced at him, waiting. Mark hesitated, then said what had been weighing on him all night. "I saw myself in it." Lawson raised a brow. Mark continued, voice low but steady. "A man was accused of something just for existing in a space where someone else thought he didn't belong. And for the first time, I recognized it for what it was, because it's exactly what I did to you." Lawson studied him, not skeptical, not angry, just listening. Mark swallowed hard. "I was wrong." It felt different saying it now. The first time, it had been an obligation, something forced in that conference room when he had no other choice. But now, it was the truth. An unfinished road. Lawson gave a small nod, turning back toward the water. "You think one call means you've changed?" he asked. Mark shook his head. I don't think one call makes up for anything." Lawson stayed quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Change isn't about one moment, Reynolds. It's about all of them. Every choice. Every interaction." Mark nodded slowly. Lawson sighed. "You've still got work to do." "I know." Finally, Lawson turned to look at him fully. There was no forgiveness in his eyes. Not yet. But there was something else, a recognition. "I'll be watching," Lawson said. Mark met his gaze. "I'd expect nothing less."